Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to what is fast becoming the most important dialogue in the entirety of your social media feed. And I'm not exaggerating. I look forward to this opportunity to speak with this incredible group of individuals that give us their wisdom and recap what's happening in the country because someone has to in a way that makes sense because there's so much that doesn't make sense. And like one of my favorite stars from the 80s, David Byrne said, stop making sense. But that's not what's happening here. We're gonna make sense of everything on this episode, the 67th episode of the new Untouchables. And we're recording this on Friday, April 24th, 2026 at approximately 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And as we go into this dialogue, I always try to set up just some sort of context given all that's coming at us. And for the last several weeks, I have neglected going to the New York Times, but I had to share this that just came out right before we started to record. If I can get to my page, and we are to the New York Times. Look at that picture, right? Donald Trump says he dislikes prediction markets. And then the subhead, well, the next sentence, his family invests in them. I keep thinking that I'm watching a Mad Magazine, National Lampoon, circus, flying circus every day, but this is our reality. And the way I wanted to put some perspective on, I think a lot of what we're going to talk about today is earlier this week, everyone, I happened to catch a documentary on Netflix. It was originally on the History Channel, and it was about the five families of New York, the Dons, the mafia Dons.
Yeah.
And I missed it when it was on the History Channel, but it was on Netflix, and it's one of those things because we have so much information that comes at us. And I happened to watch it the other day, and I'll tell you, given what we're seeing across this country with this administration, particularly as it relates to the Department of Justice and what we talk about week in and week out, and weaponizing the Department of Justice for revenge and these types of things. As I was watching this documentary on the five families, they laid out the story of course, none other than, uh, Roy Cohn, right? And what he was involved with originally, as we all know, was Senator McCarthy and prosecuting the Rosenbergs and all things the Red Scare. But it shocked me to learn that in the 70s and into the 80s, before his death, quite frankly, that he was also a defense attorney for two of the five significant, power players. It was I want to say it was the Gambino family, but definitely John Gotti. And when I think back to the influence of Donald Trump and him being his mentor and everything that he was involved with, it just painted the picture in a way that I really wasn't aware of because I knew his involvement with obviously McCarthy and the Red Scare and everything else. I did not know he was a defense attorney for the mob. And when you put that on top of this stuff that we're all talking about with Epstein, and you think of not just Dershowitz but Ken Starr, for example, and you guys come from the legal profession, you've seen it all and everything else. I just wanted to plant that seed because from where I'm sitting, given the racketeering that is so absolutely clear from this administration every single day, it's hard for me not to just be like eyes wide shut, right? How can we not all see that Trump has been involved with questionable, irreputable characters his entire career, not to mention what we know from, of course, all things David K. Johnston in reporting all of the illegal behavior that he was never held accountable for. And here we are with, probably the most astute and just the best of the profession at holding bad guys to account over decades. And here you are in this context of this world that just doesn't make sense. And of course, like I said at the outset, let's hopefully try to make sense of it. And to start things off, June, I just really don't know what to say other than I'm sure you have some thoughts.
Yes. So one of the things that I have been arguing for some time is that to understand how we got here, you have to not just look at Donald Trump, who is a moral abomination and has been his entire life, but how mainstream people can line up behind him. It is the decay of morality among the elite that needs explanation. So, as I was putting together my remarks for today, David Brooks described why he's leaving the New York Times for the Atlantic and talked about the idea of resentment as central to understanding the lack of morality. And what we need to bring back is a sense of morality, basic morality. Lying is wrong. It should not be the sine qua non of appointment to a position in this administration as it is. There is a litmus test. You must be willing to lie about the 2020 election. And that tells you, who's a made man and who isn't. But I want to, in explaining this idea of resentment as authorization for immoral behavior, I want to start with the Supreme Court. So one of the things that has happened is the leaking of the memos that show the reasoning of the court in supercharging the shadow docket. And for those who don't know, the Supreme Court, ordinarily, most of its decisions throughout history have been what's called the merits docket. That is, cases arise in the lower courts make finding of facts, the circuit courts review the law. The court is most likely to take a case if there's a split in the circuits, and then the court has the matter fully briefed, arguments on both sides, oral argument. The shadow docket is an emergency docket. It does none of that. The shadow docket involves the court issuing orders without briefing, without necessarily a finding of facts by court. The shadow docket has been used for years for emergencies. The classic use is death penalty cases. If the person is executed, no real point in reviewing whether they got due process on the underlying conviction. But the Supreme Court has, in recent years, starting in 2016, decided many more cases on the shadow docket. And what we had is a leak that shows the reasoning of the court in using this extraordinary device and supercharging it. And the key thing it shows is John Roberts, who is supposed to be the institutionalist leading the court, embracing resentment every bit as much as Alito and Thomas, who are the epitome of resentment, rationalizing partisan attacks. And it's worth taking a moment to explain this. So Roberts used the shadow docket in an extraordinary way for the first time in recent history, involving a decision involving President Obama's Clean Air Act executive orders involving power plants. And I think it's worth describing the lead up as a Congress with Mitch McConnell saying, my goal is to have Obama be a one-term president. And then in the second term, Obama would muse, oh, I take things the Republicans proposed, and now they're against them just because I proposed them. And when it comes to environmental regulation, Congress is bought hook, line, and sinker by the power companies. And particularly the Republicans, but some Democrats prefer no action to compromise action. And so Obama was so totally frustrated in the face of climate change, in the face of things that are clearly harmful and pose an existential crisis to the planet, and issued a series of executive orders. The Supreme Court, which has almost never taken an environmental case without striking down regulation, had struck down Obama's mercury emissions regulations. And then they struck down in 2016 on the shadow docket this regulation involving coal-fired plants. And when you look at Roberts' memos for why this has to be decided on the shadow docket, an emergency order, no explanation, instead of the merits docket, the traditional way the court decides things, he flags two things. First, he says, this is the most expensive regulation ever imposed on the power sector. Secondly, he says, He's really upset because, with respect to the case involving mercury emissions, the EPA director in an interview said, well, Supreme Court has ruled, but it doesn't matter all that much because the plants are already largely in compliance. And Roberts responds with pique. How dare they? How dare they say about a Supreme Court decision I was involved in that it doesn't matter because the plants are already complying with something they should have been doing anyway. Mercury emissions, everybody knows, harmful, um, can kill people in the right concentrations, public safety issue. And now he adds to that, this is the most expensive regulation ever imposed on the power sector. Well, I was at a talk John Roberts gave, and he was trying to defend the court. And he was saying, it's not really true that the court rules on a partisan basis. That is, whether there's an R or a D next to the sides that are litigated. But lots of the justices have ideologies. That's perfectly okay. It's not perfectly okay. And it's not perfectly okay because it's important to recognize that John Roberts and every other conservative on the court is appointed in an era when we don't want any more suitors. We don't want any more justices who exercise independent judgment. We, the Republican Party, before Trump, want ideologues. And what drives the ideologues, and there's a nice literature about this, is the desire to repeal the New Deal, to view the Warren Court as illegitimate, to repeal the New Deal, and to impose their own ideological preferences on the court. Not to obey the law, not to adhere to precedent, not to do what's in the best interest of the country, but to advance an ideological agenda. And note, they might, if they really believe that this is in the best interest of the country, there is some room for people with different views about what's appropriate. But what this means, and this is where resentment is so important, they view the Supreme Court that ruled in ways they don't like, that embrace civil rights, for example, or thought government regulation in the administrative state was what the country needed, as illegitimate. The court that rules in ways they don't like is illegitimate. And therefore, they are authorized to impose their own views on the country. But in the process is recognition that they're attacked for doing so. And that fuels resentment that then justifies extraordinary means. The thing about the shadow docket is not just that, as Elena Kagan said in the memos that were leaked, it's unprecedented. It's also been applied in completely hypocritical ways that cloak what the justices are doing. So they don't give reasons. But note the peak. It is saying, oh, Obama issued the regulation. The companies are complying. By the time the Supreme Court decides it, it's too late to reverse the regulations. So we've got to act now. And what do they do with Donald Trump? The hypocrisy and the unequal treatment between Obama and Trump is greater on the shadow docket than on the merits docket. So what they've done is overturn lower court rulings backed by facts to allow Trump to implement all kinds of things that are blatantly illegal. And the shadow docket has been used to allow that. The shadow docket was used to make sure Obama and Biden didn't do the same thing with respect to things like clean air regulations and student loan debt. The shadow docket has been used to let Trump get away with blatantly illegal things that involve in deporting people and undoing all kinds of harmful and implementing all kinds of harmful acts, like getting rid of most of the Department of Education, that harms people and that is completely unauthorized and illegal. So in putting that together, I want to emphasize underlying this and this window into the supposed institutionalist is a mindset that says we do not get our authority and our prestige and our standing in society from being part of an institution where we adhere to institutional norms. We get our standing in society from implementing an ideology that we've selected and the people who appoint us expect us to implement. And once you start thinking that way, first of all, John Roberts is not an institutionalist. But secondly, it justifies all kinds of things, the unbridled exercise of power and ignoring ethics. So the other thing about the court this week was more details about John Roberts' wife, who during a certain period received $10 million from her role in a recruiting firm, placing lawyers with different firms. But those firms have business before the court. And Jane Roberts, who, except for her connections, not necessarily better qualified than other people with the firm, was the single biggest rainmaker at the firm, bringing in more money than anybody else. And after there were complaints, because John Roberts did release some of the details in his ethics filings, she moved to a new firm that she started. He no longer releases how much money she makes. The current estimates that are in the press are that she has received $20 million, overwhelmingly from law firms paying her company for recruitment, that is, for helping them find lawyers, while they have business before the U.S. Supreme Court in a blatant conflict of interest. Roberts has stopped disclosing the amount she makes from this firm.
Wow. The games that the Supreme Court plays on behalf of this, to your point, shadow docket and all of the rest. I thank you for bringing that up. I'm going to put a link down below in the description. Everyone, I'll gift that article from the New York Times. It was mind boggling to me because it made really the last 15 years make sense, even though that was 10 years ago, I understood. But look at the war in Iran and where we are and all things fossil fuel, and we could go into that. But, I neglected to introduce Ms. Carbone's title. She is the Rabina Chair of Law Science and Technology at the University of Minnesota. And if that weren't enough, just to put a fine tooth point on it, she was a JD from Yale Law School and an AB magna cum laude from the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. So thank you for that detail, Ms. Carbone. I want to turn this to you, Paul. Paul Pelletier, the former veteran of the Department of Justice, and of course, adjunct professor at George Washington University and private practice. I started the conversation with this context of what took place during the Red Scare. And of course, this whole, vestibule of retribution during this time period with Trump and everything else. We saw this week, in addition to, let's just say that the ridiculousness of Kash Patel, of course, in the FBI and the $250 million lawsuit against the Atlantic for his drinking, which is now really coming to bear more clearly than it was even before he brought that lawsuit. But probably more significantly, the Southern Poverty Law Center. Do you have any context or any thoughts on that?
Yeah, a lot of thoughts on that. And I'd love to hear what June has to say about that as well as everybody else on this call. But at the end of the day, the lawsuit against, or the criminal prosecution and indictment against the Southern Poverty Law Center is just further evidence of the I hate to call it lawfare because it's not. It's just the fact that the Department of Justice has now become the tool of the administration as a whole to extract revenge on people that they don't like or people that they want to get back at for a political purpose. And so while there was all this big complaint by Trump originally that lawfare, this is lawfare, you're using the law against me, and you might say, look at if he wasn't a Republican president, he might not have been prosecuted by the when the Democrats were in charge, and that's an argument you can have, and that may or may not be real. It just really depends on the competence of the prosecutors and the attorney general. But what they've done to the Department of Justice is turned lawfare on its head, and now has turned the fact that they want to say there was lawfare during Biden, and now use it as a vehicle to extract revenge. And that's what they're doing now. And it's very dangerous in every way, shape, and form. And we've talked about the fact that they've hollowed out the Department of Justice, and they used a unique bank fraud statute that I've never charged, 18 USC 1014, which is there are no victims in this case. There is no that I can see, and there's supposedly wire fraud, there's supposedly money laundering, which is complete bullshit, and there's supposedly bank fraud under 18 USC 1014, but there will be nobody that can testify truthfully that they were a victim of any crime or of any lying or of any misuse of any bank rules. So there's that. Then we have who announced the indictment. Well, the Attorney General and Kash Patel. That's how we saw Kash Patel at that press conference. They went to Birmingham and announced that the U.S. Attorney wasn't even there. So we know where this is coming from. We know why it is, and of course, Todd Blanche scolded the press for being rude to Kash Patel. Can you believe it? That the press was actually rude to Kash Patel. How awful that is. So I think, first of all, it's just going to show you what the Department of Justice is going to be doing for the next 2.5 years. That's the direction they're going. Congress is going to need to step in. And as it relates to the Supreme Court that June just talked about, look, the courts have held, as Mark and everybody has talked to on this podcast, the courts have held, but the lower courts have held, not the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has always been the real problem here. And in my view, and as we've talked about all along on this podcast, and all the way from the con, the system is broken. What the system is broken. What June has talked about in terms of a corrupt Supreme Court, that's been going on for a long time, and there's only one way to fix that. And that is to rejigger how the court is constituted. And there are a ton of legal ways to do it. That's not going to happen until the Democrats control both houses and the presidency, and until they fix the filibuster. When I say fix the filibuster, I mean have the filibuster what it was always intended to do. And I'm telling you, that can only happen 2 years from now. But if the Democrats don't fix Citizens United, if they don't fix the Supreme Court, if they don't fix those persistent problems and economic problems that we have in this country, we're wasting our time here. We're going to be wasting our time for the next 2 years. The Democratic Party has to get very serious about that and has to have plans to legally fix it. And it can be both of those, Citizens United and the Supreme Court. I think I think that I agree with her. We've never had a Supreme Court that was ideologically constituted. It was always liberal and conservative. You had liberal justices, you had conservative justices, but these judges now are ideologically aligned. That's never happened in the history of the Supreme Court. And it's all their little society that has started bringing this together. We could talk about Leonard Leo and all that stuff, but that has to be broken up. And if you're going to wait for them all to die, our democracy will die well before then. So I think that what we've been talking about from day one in terms of realigning the economic principles and taking away the power of corporations and the wealthy and the structural problems that Democrats have to fix. The next 2 years, we can spend our times on the guardrails. But after that, assuming we get a Democratic president and Democratic houses, they've got to fix those structural problems, or we're wasting our time here, in my view.
Well, let's hope not from this perspective, Mr. Pelletier, because again, I'm going to reiterate this to the audience with as much exuberance as I possibly can. The most important information that's coming through all influencers in podcasts. I don't want to sound arrogant. It's this podcast. I see podcasts that have 7 million subscribers that don't deliver the details of what comes through week in and week out from the new Untouchables, particularly the call to the Democratic Party. What do we see from mainstream media? I don't want to mention anybody on MS Now. I don't want to mention all the major players, but they're not talking about the details. They're playing for the midterms when we know, and we've learned from this group here, there's no time to wait for the midterms. There's things that can happen now. And I want to turn this to you, Mark. Mark Dan, ladies and gentlemen, the proprietor of Dan Law, but also the former state attorney general of Ohio. And gosh, a couple of other things that I didn't really touch upon in the news, but I'm curious if you might have your radar equipped to this or in tune with it. I mean, the investigation and the silliness from obviously DOJ and to Jerome Powell based on maybe mismanagement of the refurbishments or remodeling and this, that, and the other was suddenly dropped. And in addition to that, I mean, it's just kind of like it never ends. But the indictment also. You remember when I started the podcast, I showed the picture on the front page of the New York Times 20 minutes ago of Trump saying, "Well, he's not a big fan of poly markets." I mean, what's your insight on some of those issues?
Well, look, I mean, it goes to Paul's point about the ongoing corruption of the Justice Department, the ongoing abuse of the Justice Department in ways that are just unprecedented and horrifying. Mobilizing a prosecution of Jerome Powell simply for political purposes, and transparently saying that he's doing it for political purposes is a great example of that. What's hopeful about today is that somebody in Congress stood up, and Tom Tillis, the chair of the committee that's going to consider the new nominee for Powell's jobs nomination, said, "I'm not touching this. This file is not moving off my desk until you drop this investigation." And it didn't. And they are, I mean, we go back to the whole taco analysis of Trump. Trump always chickens out. It's the only thing a bully is going to respond to is somebody pushing back. That's the worst thing. That's the only way that we're gonna be able to solve these kinds of problems. And it took finally one Republican senator who's not running for reelection, I might add, to have the intestinal fortitude to say, no, I'm not going to do this. You're not going to get a new Fed chairman until you stop using the Justice Department for this particular thing. Now, there have been 100 other abuses this month that that nobody's standing up to. I mean, Kash Patel opening an investigation of a New York Times reporter who wrote negative things about his girlfriend. Um, just a rampant abuse of the department. The the and so that is, I mean, there's just so many layers, but it just shows it doesn't take much to push back on this guy, and to get him to get him to back down. And the Democrats haven't even tried. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating to watch this happen. Nothing should move in Congress that Trump wants if he's going to continue to corrupt the Justice Department, because none of the rest of it works unless there's the rule of law. And the way the rule of law is enforced in this country is through the United States Justice Department, and corrupting it in the way they have is just is unacceptable. And every patriot needs to stand up and say it, whether they're elected or unelected. I don't care if you're a lobbyist. You just can't. A president just can't use these mechanisms because it's all going to fall apart. if it all becomes subjective, if it all becomes at the whim and direction of the president, then nobody's safe in this country, because those Republicans are going to be out of office. A lot of them Republicans in Congress are going to be out of office in 6 months. And if the way things are going, Trump's got the highest disapproval rating yeah, of the entire history as being a president as of this moment. He's going, there's going to be a new president, a Democratic Party president in all likelihood, if the clown car doesn't completely screw it up. And so in the last and do we want another 4 years of the Democrats persecuting the people that in the Trump administration? I don't think we want to do it, because at the end of the day, there's no time to govern when everybody's focused on retribution 24/7, as they appear to be in DC. So, but it's hopeful that Powell on this Powell situation, that Tillis stood up and Trump once again backed down. It just was so easy. Why don't we try it more often? I mean, wouldn't that be something? The other, the other fascinating story, I think, today in the Justice Department is the prosecution of the Special Forces soldier who was betting on the removal of Maduro when he was well aware that Maduro was about to be removed, because he was training for the mission itself, actually participated in the mission. Bet 32,000 to win. I think it was like 600,000 or 700,000. A U.S. soldier, and he did it in a marketplace that's being promoted and consulted with by Trump's kids. So you've got so again. Did that slip through? Is that not was that not approved by the White House? Is the Justice Department actually asserting its authority to do its job? I don't know what the story is there, but there's got to be a hell of a story there. And if you want to understand the history of how the Supreme Court got to this point where they were, I'm all over the place, but where they're using the shadow docket to kill regulations and advance the agenda of the oligarchy in this country. All you have to do is listen to the podcast series, The Master Plan, that the Lever has put together, and they're on their second season of that. But this was literally all written out by former Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell, who was at the time the general counsel for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He literally wrote a plan to allow corporate interests and rich people in this country to co-opt politics and government, and to make it legal. And a central piece of that was this takeover of the U.S. Supreme Court that they accomplished. And it's brilliant in its diabolicalness, and it continues afoot. There has been, I mean, what Obama wanted to do on the power plants is nothing compared to the gutting of environmental regulations that have taken place over the last year in the Trump administration, the gutting of consumer protection regulations, the gutting of any oversight and regulation of big business and certainly of tech, and the prediction markets, and this alleged commodity trading, which is just, it's just a formula for corruption and abuse, is just yet another example of that. But Congress, Congress has to do what they did this week or last week when Tillis said, no chairman, unless you get rid of this investigation. The and you know, it's like everything else that we've seen, and I think that's the other story that we've been talking about here for now a year. That the rest of the public is catching up with is that everything has also got. Look, I mean, it's almost like there was a sequel made which combined Game of Thrones and The Sopranos called the Trump family. Um, he runs foreign policy like it's Game of Thrones. It's might is right. And so and the only reason to exercise power is because you can. And he's running the government and the regulatory structure and the criminal enforcement structure um, uh, like a mafia don that you don't nothing is going to get done or not done unless you pay your vig, unless there's somebody is cashing in, whether it's his sons, whether it's his son-in-law, whether it's Trump directly, whether it's these committees that I mean, a term limited president with $1 billion of fundraising is absurd. He's not running for anything. But in order to, whether it's his inauguration committee, I mean, he's created all these vehicles to pay tribute to him without any regard for what the consequences to the American public, the consequences to our health, the consequences to to the ability of working class Americans to get from point A to point B. I mean, we still live in. I was at heard from the chief economist for the federal court system today at a seminar I attended, and he reiterated that it is still true that the top 1/10 of 1% in this country controls more wealth than all the rest of us. Top 1/10 of 1%. And if you start to add in, if you expand that number to the top 10%, it's a devastating disproportionate distribution. And when you have a government that's for sale and such economic inequality at the same time, it's a recipe for disaster, and it's a recipe, frankly, for a revolution if they're not careful. And I don't want to see that happen in this country. I mean, all the people I represent, the consumers that have been screwed by banks or the or people who are being poisoned, by pollution in their water streams, is that they is or the opioid. We represent the children who were born addicted to opioids, and I mean, is all they want is to be, regular Americans, get their piece of the American dream, and not have to worry that the government is going to not prevent bad things from happening to them, but be enabling the people that want to bring them harm to their health, to their financial well-being, and that's what's happening now. And it's starting to become clear, and people are starting to see it. So I know I'm all over the place today, but let's celebrate the small victories. We had one senator who stood up to the Justice Department and they backed down.
Well, you identified the big C we've been talking about forever. It's the corruption, and I think you nailed that perfectly. The thoughts that came to mind while you were, deconstructing that, Mark. I mean, my first film, Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream, and I'll post it down below for people to check out, is a poster that has the Statue of Liberty against the American flag backdrop, and the caption says "America for Sale." I've been in the midst of this now for 14 years, and you guys have brought it all full circle. And, again, going back to the opening here, when you're talking about this criminal racketeering family, particularly in light of the poly market trades and just the nakedness of this being a combination of Game of Thrones and, of course, The Sopranos, again, going back to Roy Cohn, and the name occurred to me. It was Salerno that he was defending as well as Gotti,
Hmm.
meaning Roy Cohn. But they were literally mob lawyers, in
Hmm.
addition to what happened at the FBI. And I've seen some funny stuff go on the internet regarding Cash Patel and some association with J. Edgar Hoover, which is hilarious. But I got to turn this to you, Lewis. Lewis Clark, of course, the executive director of the Government Accountability Project. And week in and week out, Mr. Clark has, brought to us revelations and revelations of stuff that he and his firm, representing the top whistleblowers in the country from every regulatory body, and things that are happening. And I just think to myself throughout this whole process, my God, I can only imagine people that have information within the FBI that I'm sure you can't talk about, but it goes through every institution of this country as they're literally falling apart before our eyes. And as Mark said, we've been talking about this for a year, and now the rest of the country is catching up. What kind of insight can you offer the viewers just discovering us for the first time, what you're involved with, and how important it is to Americans getting the understanding of what we have to do as a populace to really get our heads around these stories to turn the tables?
Well, for one thing, there's a there is an avalanche coming of people from inside these institutions that are, essentially being destroyed, like the Department of Justice. And there's an avalanche of people who are talking about what's going on there and describing it. And there's been a few shadow hearings, which is the hearings of the minority in the Senate, in particular, or the House as well. And so they're beginning to do hearings, and I can tell you that I think it's inevitable that we're going to have wall-to-wall hearings once the House changes uh, uh, parties, which even could happen even before November, actually, the way it's going. And so it's going to be, and another thing too that's happening is and I don't think that you can, you, I don't think you can underestimate the importance of this, is that the federal government has lost the sense in terms of the judges in this country, the federal judges, and many courts of appeals, although fewer judges there, and they're losing the credibility. So there's no sort of presumption of regularity that the judges are facing, and they're doing a really pathetic job of defending the administration. Because one is a number of them don't have their heart in it. Another one is the talent has left like like crazy. And another one is that um it's really hard it's really hard to to bring indictments and to take whatever actions you're taking if you don't have the evidence. And so it's just it's really amazing after 1 year how devastating this has been for the rule of law and the I guess the process for exercising that rule of law. And we've never been busier. Gone to we used to have we used to go over our intakes, once, 1 hour, hour and a half a week. Now we've had to go to 2 and 3 meetings a week just to deal with the number of people coming forward. We had 1,500 coming forward last year. And this year we're at the rate that we're going now. It's going to be over 1,800 that are coming to us, this year. We can't even begin to handle that number of cases. And not all these people are right, about their whistleblowing. In addition to that, we have to make a decision about what is the most important. But I can tell you there's some very important things that are coming down the pike that will be very, I think it'll be interesting for this panel to discuss in not too distant future. No, I think you're on mute.
I'm just like, wow, and I'm really happy of the flow of this today, Lewis, because that leads us to William K. Black, Bill, who I've always in our work, regarded as kind of the oracle of regulation and corruption and malfeasance on a massive macro, but also granular level that has taught us all of these details, which are all playing out right before our eyes. And we just heard Bill, and I'll just give you a quick introduction to the viewers, and you can all see his bio down below in the description as well. But William K. Black is also a professor of criminology. He's an expert in all things regulation, economics, and all things the legal aspect of what we're dealing with, most known for, of course, the savings and loan crisis and writing the book, The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One. And I'll have a link down below for that as well. But Bill, I mean, we just got really the mother lode there, right? Based on whistleblowers and everything that you have been revealing to us the whole time. What's your reaction to your colleagues on this dialogue?
Yeah, let me try to put this together. I was also a former federal programs branch attorney, as June was as well. And that's the group that is particularly almost ceased to exist. We were the ones who would defend those federal programs of the Trump administration, but most of our successors have left office rather than be part of these cover-ups. So let me put together a number of things that have been said. Let's go to the mercury. That was a very expensive regulation, right? And you heard about Justice Powell. Justice Powell didn't just represent, the General Trade Association of Commerce. He specifically was on the boards of directors and was the leading defense lawyer of the tobacco industry, and he was on the ethyl company, which was the folks who put lead in gasoline. And June was talking about mercury. The thing that those three things have in combination is neurotoxins. I defended the constitutionality of the Black Lung program when as a federal programs branch lawyer, so I'll get a little wonky about coal in all of this. When you burn coal, it forms mercury is in coal, and it's particularly in lignite coal, much heavier concentrations. It goes up through the smokestack as a gas. It settles all kinds of places, but in particular in the water. Bacteria essentially consume it and transform it. The bacteria are eaten by fish. Bigger fish eat littler fish up the chain. That's called bioaccumulation. And it means that the mercury levels concentrate and concentrate and concentrate. And therefore, when you're pregnant and trying to have a very healthy diet and you're eating lots of fish, if you have this process, you can, if you have a fairly heavy fish diet, and the best estimates were that this was in the range of 600,000 children in the early 2000s were being born with what's in jargon subclinical loss of IQ. 600,000 every year. Estimated costs of this are in the $10 billion annually. If you use proper scrubbers, as they're called, on the smokestacks, which is what the rule was doing that June was talking about, you remove 95% of the mercury. We had a dramatic reduction in mercury emissions, which had enormously positive effects and saved money. vast amounts of money. Right? It's 3 times as expensive, at least, not to do the scrubbers, is what the scientific work showed. So let's go back to Roberts. He's upset that this is the most expensive regulation. He's not upset that we are literally assaulting pregnant mothers and fetuses to the tune of 600,000 annually, and that the cost of that vastly exceeds the regulatory cost. In other words, they weren't pricing in the true cost of coal, lignite in particular. And so they were saving money by adopting this rule. Society as a whole was saving tons, like about $6 billion annually. And that outraged the Chief Justice. Just as it outraged Powell. Powell, in his famous Powell memorandum, is just like beside himself that Ralph Nader dares to say that we shouldn't be killing people with our products. They considered that New Dealish, and that's what they had to strike down. And the way they came up with this, if we can talk about in future things, is the unitary executive theory. And that, I'll just super simplify it, says the president can do anything damn well pleases in the executive branch. He can get rid of anyone and everyone. And there was one exception to that in the Supreme Court. And that's interesting because it isn't textual. They just made it up. They said, oh, except for the Fed. Well, why? Because the conservative project has always been concerned that they didn't want the Fed to be, non-existent in terms of its independent authority because they were afraid of inflation and such. So out of the blue of the western skies, they created this exception for the one damn area they cared about. And it's only because of that single exception and the coincidence of this Republican chair that we created this unique circumstances where Powell wasn't able to be removed. Otherwise, they now take the position they can get rid of anyone. And by the way, if we go back to the savings and loan debacle, that means Ed Gray would have been removed if we ran the history. And they would put in someone who would have taken the opposite approach, and instead of the savings loan debacle having virtually no macroeconomic effect, it would have had a catastrophic macroeconomic effect akin to the great financial crisis.
Well, and Keating would have walked free.
And Keating and all the other crooks would have. Right? We now have a single point of failure, if you think of it in engineering terms. Engineered by the Federalist Society as a project of 30 plus years, and the Supreme Court, which, of course, engineering the Supreme Court was also the Federalist Society's big project. And that's what Powell is all about. So anyway, this ain't just money. People end up, little kids end up with severe losses of IQ that can never be changed. And over the last 2 years, because of the reversal, the output of mercury at major places has increased 290%, where they use lignite coal in particular.
Yeah.
That is why we need whistleblowers so critically. Yes, it's money, but mostly it's this destruction of democracy and destruction of the rule of law against the worst liars and cheats. And they go together. The big fraudsters go together with the corruption in government because they're always seeking immunity from the law. They are scared to death, I will repeat, of two things in life: whistleblowers and an active, effective prosecution effort by the Department of Justice. Decades ago, and to some extent now, they were also afraid of journalists revealing what they were doing.
Amen. And, I want to just express to the audience, it was somewhere in about 17 years ago, probably. It was that long ago, I suspect, that it was a fateful Sunday morning. I happened to be watching Bill Moyers when the world had come unglued after the 2008 great financial crisis, and nothing made sense. And I discovered William K. Black. My life was never the same. And I hope that everybody watching this understands how powerful Mr. Black's fights in the trenches for decades has been, and he's still fighting on behalf of the integrity of law and liberty and justice for all of us. And I want to revert back to you really quick, Mark. When he was talking about mercury, and these aren't lessons that we didn't learn in the past. You lived in Cleveland. You guys were under acid rain for most of the early 70s. Could you just talk about the impact of?
Oh yeah, the air quality is terrible here, and if this administration has its way, it will go right back to doing that. They would prefer to mine coal over cleaner solutions for creating energy. They like it's a joke of some kind that children are going to be dumber. And less safe. That's what we're facing here, and we made such great progress over with heroes like Bill and his brethren in the EPA and the Justice Department in the various regulatory agencies, the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. I mean, these folks had expertise. That we honored their expertise, we honored their knowledge, we honored science, and respected it. And it took years to make this better, and they're doing everything they can to undo it. And it's just tragic. And I mean, we're let's have the biggest possible cars spewing the most bad exhaust that we can possibly have. That's not because they have a theory that that's going to make us safer or healthier, but because they are paying off the people that put them in office very transparently. But I think the jig is up, in that in the next 6 months we have Ohio's primary coming up in a week or so here. In the next 6 months, we're going to see a dramatic shift in Congress. We're going to see a dramatic shift in governor's offices. I ran for office in 2006 when we thought George Bush was a fascist, and he was randomly invading countries in the Middle East. Well, think about where we are now, and we had the wind at our back after the year of in that election cycle. This is going to be a unprecedented election cycle. And all we have to do is make sure that people understand and know as much as possible about what's going on. So I'll do your job, Patrick. Share this and like it, because the more people understand about the way that this administration is exchanging corrupt payments and quid pro quos for making you less safe and less financially secure, the greater the impact of that change that's about to come is going to be.
June, can I ask you to give us some closing remarks?
Sure. I'm rarely optimistic, but I am optimistic about some of this. The corruption, like the corruption in Hungary, is finally so bad that people are beginning to see, one at a time, that there's a connection between the corruption we've just discussed and what's happening in their lives. So, among the comments this week are that why is Eric Trump considered the dumb brother compared to Don Jr., who seems to me equally venal? Because Eric is so dumb, he holds a press conference to announce the grift he's cashing in. Uh, why did Kristi Noem get fired? Because she wasn't just taking her cut on the sly. She and Corey Lewandowski were saying to contractors, hey, you know, grease the palms and we'll give you the money. And this is happening so blatantly at a time when people are hurting that for the first time since the great financial crisis, 52% of the country think Dems are better for the economy than Republicans, even though in 2025, the public said the Dems are more corrupt than Republicans. Where are they getting this from? Well, if you don't hide it effectively, you may eventually hitting people over the head over and over again, and most importantly in the pocketbook, create the link between the people who are motivated by resentment. Donald Trump saying, I get it. Those elites over there, they're out to do you in. When they can finally see that Donald Trump has his hand in their pockets, all things become possible.
Well, thank you for that. Paul, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I'd love to leave it on a lack of optimism. Um, if June's right, and I think she is, that things are lining up for the Democrats, the reality is, if that happens, we get Democrats. And the reality is, just as an example, Roe v. Wade happened in 1972. Democrats were in power for a long time thereafter, and they never ensconced that right for women in legislation, and they could have. And so the reason why we're in the problem that we're in is because people, in my view, have chosen populist candidates because their economic situation is dire. And we look at it every day in the paper. It's dire for a number of reasons. It's dire because they can't get health care, they can't get homes, their taxes are fucked up, their wages are too low, and they don't have jobs. And the Democrats have really, in my view, not tackled those problems since Obama. And we're in this place in a long way because Obama, as you know from the con, allowed the merger of billionaires and corporations to take over and not deal with the people who are getting screwed, the people who lost their houses, did not do anything to help those. So we're in this problem a lot because of Democrats. Now, I'll take a Democrat over a Republican anytime, but the point of the matter is if they do get elected in the next 2 years, they've got to put the guardrails on. I don't know that that's going to be possible, but they've got to do it. But in the next 4 years, assuming the presidents, they've got to fix everything else. I'm not kidding, because we're going to be in this same place. We're going to be in this exact same place. They've got to tackle those 5 things that I just talked about. And if they don't, and it has to be a Project Hail Mary type program where everybody has to be working together and they got one shot at it. And if they don't do it, we're going to be right back in the goddamn same place we're in now. And all this optimism is going to be bullshit, because we're going to get somebody else like Trump, a populist who's going to end up doing nothing. So yes, I'm optimistic that the Democrats are going to be elected in the next term, and maybe even the next term. I'm pessimistic that it's going to be the Democrats.
I want to respond because you're talking my talk, and I've been saying this for a long time. I have put together a conference. Let's plan after Trump. And what did my law professor friends say? You know, modern law, incremental reformist stuff of the kind they could have presented 20 years ago. What we're seeing from the public is they want somebody who is unlike fraud from, Trump, who pretends he's going to shake things up, but is only going to line his own pockets. They want somebody who's really going to shake things up. And I've been saying you don't get that until we have a real crisis, because only with a real crisis can you take on the Epstein class. But Graham Plattner, the radical, maybe former Nazi, um, is leading Janet Mills by 30 points in Maine. And I like Janet Mills. They're both leading Susan Collins, the longtime Republican senator who's talks the talk and then votes for Trump. And what people want is to shake things up. But let's be clear on what that means. I was enraged by David Brooks today. Why? He talks about resentment. He tells the story of a guy who got fired from his job 30 years ago because, his skills were outmoded and they automated his job. When he left the plant, his fellow workers lined the pathway to his car and cheered him on. And he said that was the high point of his life, and he hasn't had anything like it since. And he voted for Trump to shake things up. But here's what he didn't say. He talked about morality as the answer, and morality coming from roles. And then he pivots at the end to talking about we need to bring back the idea of sin. But here's what he doesn't say. We've dismantled the roles, and you don't get it back without getting rid of the Supreme Court, without taming the Epstein class, without making people believe they're all in it together, because nobody should have the kind of money Elon Musk has. Nobody should be that rich. And only when you get to the point where we need each other do you also bring back a shared morality. And yes, Democrats can do it, but they have to get it through. They have to tame the Epstein class. They have to make it clear that anybody who engages in climate change denialism is bought. And they have to make it clear that we have the Supreme Court of the Epstein class. And I don't know how you get there, because you have to get the message through.
Well, there you go. Because look, I feel like I'm the luckiest guy in the world because of you folks. I grew up my whole life just admiring American heroes from different time periods of our existence, from the American Revolution through the abolitionists, through the Civil War. Obviously knew all the problems of the Reconstruction and everything that followed into Jim Crow, but man, were there heroes during the progressive rights era. Man, were there heroes that came out of World War II and gave us this country of the middle class. And it was always sustained by character. From my favorite writers to my favorite musician to my favorite athletes, those characters. And what I see every week from you folks is the exemplification of character in addition to genius, intelligence. And what I try to convey to the people that are watching this is you cannot give up hope on the United States. What you've got to do is you've got to reorient yourself to not buying lies. We are overcome by this groundswell of media and algorithms and deception and this, that, and the other. And again, not to hit it too often, but man, there are people that have 7 million viewers that don't give you 1/10% of what comes out of one episode of the new Untouchables, let alone the last 67. So on behalf of everyone that gives their time for free, on behalf of the United States for liberty and justice for all, I'd like to thank Paul Pelletier. I'd like to thank Lewis Clark, Mark Dan, William K. Black, and of course, June Carbone. And I'm in nobody's category here. I'm just a guy that got lucky and found them. And unfortunately, they give us our time week in, week out. And I just, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for that. My name is Patrick Lovell. Until next time, check out thenewuntouchables.com. Check out thecleannewdeal.org. And we'll be back here each and every week until we break through. Please like and subscribe and share. don't hesitate to get this to everyone you know as fast as you can. Thank you, and all the best to you guys. Onwards and upwards.
Take care.
Yeah.